Good morning, Stacy.
Good morning.
All right, let's call the meeting to order. Welcome to the June or May, end of May meeting of the Maine Commission on Governmental Ethics and Election Practices. We'll start right with agenda item 1, which is ratification of the meeting minutes. I reviewed these and I move that they are ratified as written. Second. Is there any discussion? Is everybody here? We can have a voice vote. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Agenda item 2 is a complaint against the American Leadership Committee, Maine, made by Mr. Clardy. And Jonathan, can you give us, are we gonna, that's right, we have a couple of people. Is that Mr. Burkhan?
Hi there, how are you?
Good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well, doing well.
And who's with you there?
Emily Hogan should be here as well, though I admit that on my current Zoom screen, I cannot see her, but I assume she's there.
I think I see her.
Yes,
Perfect.
good morning.
Oh, now I do. I switched to gallery view, so there we go.
Okay, terrific. So our normal procedure here, as you're well aware, is that we'll have Jonathan kind of tell us about the complaint and about your response, and then we'll have some testimony and we'll talk about it.
Excellent.
So Jonathan?
Sure. This is a complaint by Mr. Clardy against the American Leadership Committee Maine PAC. And he's taking issue with the financial reporting by the PAC. And
Mr. Clardy, if you want to come up to the witness chair, you may.
You may have to be on camera too.
Absolutely.
The way I boiled it down in the staff memo was we saw 3 issues with the PAC's reporting that Mr. Clardy was raising. One was that asserting that the PAC should have reported unpaid debts or in-kind contributions for legal services that it received from the Alliance Law Group. And the staff agrees with that contention. We think the PAC should have reported those legal services and didn't, and it amended its report. So we're recommending that be viewed as a violation. The 2 other points that Mr. Clardy is raising about the PAC's reporting is that the DLCC paid staff to work on independent expenditure communications in a lot of different states, including Maine. And he believes those are reportable expenditures that, well, he believes they should have been reported by the ALC Maine PAC as in-kind contributions because these are payments for services that benefited the PAC. And they should have been in the PAC's reports. And he also is asserting that the expenditure dates for the independent expenditure communications that the PAC listed in its independent expenditure reports were not correct. That in fact, they made commitments earlier to engage in these communications, and those earlier dates should have been reflected in the independent expenditure. So I'll let him speak for himself, but that's how we summarize it.
Terrific, thank you. Any questions from commissioners for Mr. Wick? Mr. Clark?
Thank you, commissioners. First off, I apologize. I managed to not bring the final draft of my talking points, so I'm going to be winging a little bit on this. To start with, this complaint started up following up on my oral commentary during the November meeting, where I pointed out that the ALC Maine was reporting drop dates of October 3rd for video ads. And we're also reporting those ads, or the original application date for those ads is October 3rd. To be honest, it took me 2 months after the election and after that meeting to get over my post-election fatigue and actually get around to putting pen to paper on doing that, which had the side benefit of allowing me to see what ALC Maine would put in place as their final, yes, we are done, everything balances out to 0. This is all our costs, all our contributions. So anyway, I raised 2 issues, as Mr. Wayne said, and dealing with the video production date. In their initial report and in all amended reports, the ALC Maine lists on October 3rd a $6,600 item for digital advertising, production gear, rental, and crew. So, which, to me, given Mr. Burgon's response to this complaint, he says that the production equipment and the production costs were invoiced much later than the original ad buy. So if that was reported as being invoiced on October 3rd, which was apparently their original position, correct me if I'm wrong, please, correct me, Mr. Burgon, then that was when they were billed for renting production equipment. But the question remains, when did they actually rent the equipment? When did they commit to renting the equipment? Mr. Wayne and your staff find it very plausible that ALC Maine did decide to rent production equipment, go out, film some scenes, hire some actors, run through some scripts to produce these videos prior to them actually deciding on, who they were going to target with the videos. To my mind, that qualifies as being an expenditure for the design and production of advertising. They may not have had their final list of who they were going to target, but they knew they were going to target somebody with it. So that's when, when they first decided to commit to, we're going to spend money, we're going to get the equipment, we're going to go film scenes. That would have been the obligation. I admit that may be overly simplistic, but it seems common sense to me. And given the discussion you guys may remember from October about, invoice versus commitment date, I would have expected that to be amended to correspond to, when did you guys commit to producing these videos? Through, I think, 2 amendments, that item stayed the same. I haven't looked to see how many other of the items were for video production. So
That's what I was going to ask. Can you explain how this complaint is this portion of this complaint is different from the question that we considered last time?
the question we considered last time was the mailers, specifically one mailer, I believe, and the top donor disclaimer.
Right.
And on the mailer, after much back and forth, you all concluded that, I think it was October 12th, was an acceptable date for them to report as obligating to the mailer, because that was when they had it printed and
Right.
they had the postage and all that fun stuff.
Right.
And, so this is
referring to the videos.
the videos where I don't know if any of you have actually produced a video, but it doesn't happen overnight. Especially if you have to line up actors and someplace to do the filming. There's a little bit of coordination that has to take place ahead of time. So it's dropping or being dropped on the 3rd. Presumably, it was produced sometime prior to that. And the decisions on what was going to be included in it happened even further prior to that. I know Mr. Birkin and Mr. Wayne expended quite a bit of time debating, whether or not you should reconsider the production date or the commitment date for the mailer, the October 12th mailer date. And I spent about a page or so going through that, primarily to point out that even as Mr. Birkin was arguing for October 12th as being an acceptable date, in the information they provided, they were providing factual data that they had an email chain discussing, reviewing the contents of that mailer, running it past legal back, I think it was September 26th or so. So, there's a dichotomy between, what they were presenting then and what the facts that they even were kind of flashing under your nose, but not pointing out to you was. And, I just wanted you to keep that in mind when deciding, how much credibility you have to any information that Mr. Burkon does or does not share in that regard, because he's not staff at ALC or DLCC. He's an outsider. He only knows what information they've provided. And as their counsel, he is under no obligation to share anything that would undermine their position or cause you to decide against him. So if it sounds like I'm trying to impugn his credibility, yes, I am, because professionally, he's part of his job is if you want to get lost in the weeds deciding on this, he will help you get straight on out there so that you don't notice the things that might be adverse to his argument. So that's the crux of the video production plan. They rented the equipment well prior to that date. They went out, they filmed it well prior to that date. They knew they were going to be targeting Maine candidates with it. The only question was which ones. But that was a final decision in terms of which ones they did actually produce it prior. So I would say that constitutes an expenditure and a commitment at that time. That's the meat of that.
Okay.
Before we wander off, do any of you have any questions particular to that before we?
Does anybody have any questions on that issue or Mr. Clardy?
I know it's in here somewhere, but if you could just, what date do you think that was appropriate?
I honestly am not sure what date. And, to be honest, I think if you do find that it was prior to October 3rd, there's going to have to be some follow-up here to actually figure out what date would be appropriate, because there really isn't anything in the available material that I found. I was mining their evidence for clues. I wasn't going out and looking for records of, did they have a casting call or anything like that. Mainly just, there's something there that needs to be looked at. It's the level of investigation I was trying to confine myself to on that part of the complaint.
Okay, let's move on to the.
Okay. So the in-kind contributions.
Yeah.
While I was looking at those filings, I noticed that there was a remarkable absence of any administrative costs. There was no reporting of any legal costs during the election or even during their end of year filing, which I'm pretty sure Mr. Berking does not work for free. So, that struck me as odd. And so not having legal costs listed was a big question mark. And that led to the, what staff time did they report? Because, running ALC Maine takes time. The DLCC form presumably, and my understanding of how these subsidiary packs work is, they declare ALC Maine as a main pack so that they can segregate all their main activities from their other national activities. So DLCC forms ALC, which forms ALC Maine. DLCC gives money to ALC, which gives money to ALC Maine. Now, once that money gets to ALC Maine, it's no longer a DLCC issue. So when ALC Maine, under the supervision of the DLCC's independent expenditure director, is deciding how to further disperse that money, is deciding which campaigns to target, is deciding what they want to say in their digital advertising, what they want to send out as mailers. That's ALC's main staff time. So once they're into the details on that, the costs there are either ALC management or strategy or whatnot, or administrative costs for filing reports. And I don't know about you guys, but yeah, keeping this thing accurate, even for my little minuscule campaign, seemed like it took a chunk of time. For ALC Maine, they had multiple campaigns that they were targeting, multiple vendors. So I would presume it took a significant amount of time. And we're not talking about for a very long period. They first registered, I think it was the 29th of August. Election, November 11th or November 8th. So we're talking 2.5 months of time and all those decisions to be made. So there should be something there in terms of a significant chunk of time. And DLCC staff time is not cheap. Now, the independent expenditure director position, which I included their job listing for that, that's 150 to 170,000 a year. I think I had that worked out to somewhere around $80 to $90 an hour. So, you know, it adds up real quick if you have a staff meeting with him and a couple of his subordinates who, according to salary survey on Glassdoor, I think the political subdirector or political director, campaign coordinator, whatever, was about 90,000 a year. You know, that's a chunk of change. It adds up, and it adds up quickly, especially if you've got a lot to discuss. Even their phone bank time, if you look at that, 40 hours, it was a little over 40 hours of phone bank time at about $38, $39 per hour. So, you know, there's some time there that should be accounted for. Now, your staff has pointed out that there are several other national organizations which apparently haven't reported that time or broken down time they spent on Maine specific campaigning either. To me, that's it. That's kind of irrelevant because just because one doesn't make it right for the others. If the RSLC has been deficient, by all means, please give them a good thumping. I've been nagging them for months that, you know, they need to actually take an honest look at you know, their operations and make sure that they're clean. Because if you apply a standard, one standard to the DLCC, I expect it to be applied to them too. The other aspect is, I think from a public policy perspective, not expecting national organizations to track the amount of time spent in at least in aggregate on their main campaigns is a really bad policy. I mean, if you're going to fine a first-time 20-something-year-old candidate $350 for blowing a reporting date, is it fair to set a lower standard for a group that is funded and, you know, more resiliently funded, is backed by paid professionals, to not meet those same reporting standards? You know, I don't see that being good policy. And quite honestly, you know, given that I am not sure that there are any federal agencies that are monitoring the state-specific national organizations, because DLCC and RSLC are kind of unique in that they're not federal election PACs. So I don't think, you know, I don't think the FEC has anything to say about their operations, which means it's up to you guys.
I don't know whether they do or not.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Mr. Burkheim should be able to answer that question fairly easily. But leave it, you know, regardless of that, if you're going to hold Maine politicians, Maine political action committees to a standard of, you know, reporting contributions of staff time, then do you really want to be the ones telling the Maine public that, oh, well, you know, those big guys from away, they get a pass because it's too much trouble for them. that's really the crux of that argument. So, you know, ALC Maine, by that standard, they should be reporting the contributions of staff time that they got from the DLCC. They're organizationally separate from the DLCC. They're a separate corporation from the DLCC. So it is a clear transfer. It is a clear contribution. Whether the DLCC kept good enough books to answer that question on their own, that's a whole different matter, but that's not the ALC Maine's responsibility. ALC Maine is responsible for reporting a valuation for that time. And that's kind of pretty much that one.
Great, thank you. Does anybody have questions for Mr. Clark at this time? Is there more testimony in favor of the complaint or?
No, I think they're here more for, so I wouldn't feel all alone in the room.
That's great. Commissioner Hastings, yes.
Without going into how I feel on this, your complaint was one of the most researched and carefully written that I have ever seen come from an individual. And you must have put an enormous amount of time into this, and I'm impressed with that.
Actually, I have been working hard to not put an enormous amount of time. But I have focused mainly on making sure that if I say, you know, A equals B, that there is a connection between A and B. If I let loose on my inclination to go way out into the weeds, I probably could have told you how many other video production costs there were and given you an exact quote on that. But thank you, sir.
And you brought us kind of a novel question, and that the novel question, it seems to me, is whether small activities on the part of nationwide organizations to support a state organization are reportable. That's I don't know that we've considered that question before.
I think it is kind of novel from Mr. Wayne's analysis. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, I mean, this particular kind of assertion hasn't come up in a complaint that I can recall.
Yeah. You know, it's something that's worth considering.
Yeah, I mean, you know, what do we do about getting stepped on by giants?
Well, thank you. Mr. Burkott.
Thank you so much to the commission for allowing us to present as you have during the last two hearings, and thank you to Mr. Clardy for his presentation as well. I think the complaint addresses three specific issues, and I just wanted to take them in turn. The first is the omission of the legal fees, the debt on the initial report, or when it first would have been reportable debt. And then the second issue is the date, the correct independent expenditure date for the videos, and the third issue being the staff time. So doing them in order. On the first issue regarding the omission of legal fees, I think we concede that that was an omission and that those fees should have been included as debt on the report when they were due, which would have been the March report. It would have been the amended January quarterly, and it's 42-day post general report. We amended those reports after, reviewing the issue and consulting with the staff to include the November and December invoices as unpaid debt. And then when the invoices were paid by the DLCC, that in-kind contribution and remaining expenses were timely reported on the April quarterly report. So prior to this hearing, we took corrective action to correct what was an omission, an inadvertent omission by our client on those initial reports. I don't know, and this may be a question for Mr. Wayne, if this is the appropriate time to seek the waiver of the penalty, or that should happen at a different time in the hearing.
I think what I'll do is when we make a motion to impose the penalty, I'll see if you wish to seek a waiver.
Excellent. needless to say, and we can deal with it at that point in the hearing, we agree with the staff's analysis regarding the appropriateness of reducing the penalty, and happy to get into the reasons for that when we get to that point later in the hearing. On the second issue and the third issue, so I think just a broader point here. Mr. Clardy's bringing to you what we would consider to be policy arguments more than legal arguments, that he thinks the law should be a certain way or the rules should be a certain way. But that's not the way that the rules are. And I think that distinction is important because the only reasonable expectation that the commission can have of the regulated community is that they follow the rules as commonly understood at the time that the activity took place. And so in looking through the particular issue here, I think it is relevant, right, to look at what the staff says its consistent advice has been on the question of when IE reports are due. And I'm just reading from the staff report here on page 7, which says that our consistent advice has been an IE report is triggered only when the committee has directed the vendor to print mailings supporting or opposing specific candidates. So in the context of mailers, the consistent advice has been to report only when the committee has directed the vendor to print mailings supporting or opposing specific candidates. The staff acknowledges, right, it's not unusual for vendors to prepare content that could be used in mailings. It's in fact necessary to be used in mailings that could support or oppose multiple candidates. And obviously that would have to happen before the final directive to the vendor to print mailings supporting or opposing specific candidates is given. And that just raises a policy question as to when the report is due. Is it due when you first incur any potential production expenses that might be used in a potential independent expenditure, even if you don't know the particular candidate with whom those production costs will be associated? In the context of legislative races, often the same footage and the same materials are used in multiple races, right? Do you go back? Do you report it then? Maybe put a question mark as to which candidates will be supported or opposed? Or do we have a rule that it's triggered only when the committee has directed the vendor, in the case of mailings, to print mailings supporting or opposing specific candidates? There's no question as to what the staff says its rule has been, right? They say it very clearly. They have chosen a particular path to advise committees to follow. And we followed that advice, certainly after the first hearing, once it became clear that that was the standard. And we followed that advice as applied to digital ads. Now, obviously, mail and digital are two different mediums, so you have to kind of apply the same legal principle to a slightly different platform. But we commit to purchase a digital ad buy when we prepay for the buy from the applicable platform, which the platform then spends down on a daily basis. And the reported expenditure date was the date that the ads were sent to the applicable digital vendors, similar to the date that a mailhouse vendor prints the ad. Now, it is theoretically still possible at that point to modify or pull the ads, but as we discussed at the last hearing, the potential for modification is not enough. I think Mr. Clardy is in one place from a policy standpoint. At the first hearing, we were in a different place where we were on a theoretically possible standard. And the commission staff said, no, you guys are both wrong. We're going to take the Goldilocks approach, right? We're going to go in the middle and say that, it's kind of that middle ground approach. And that's the approach that we followed with the digital ad. So if the commission wants to change its position on that for next cycle, that's obviously within the commission's right to do that, whether that's through a rule or through guidance. We think that would be administratively unworkable, but if that's the rule, we will obviously follow it. But that's not the rule, and that's not what the staff says the rule is. So trying to go back and impose a standard that was not the standard at the time the ads took place is not a fair way to administer the law to committees that are trying to follow the rules. I also just want to make a point on the emails that Mr. Clardy raises. Those emails discuss mailers, not digital ads. So the relevance to this particular complaint is a bit unclear to us. But either way, we followed the standard that the staff has articulated and the commission enforced, and in fact enforced against our committee at the last hearing. regarding the staff time, fundamentally, I think it is the same issue, which is it plausible that the commission could and the staff could require national organizations to be like Emily and me and track our time minute by minute, hour by hour, such that they could file reports in states, stating exactly how much time they spent on a particular, in a particular state or set of communications. Yeah, they could do that. Now, I will tell you, I'm not aware of any other state that does that, but you could do that. But as the staff laid out, even in, I think, clearer fashion in regarding the next complaint involving the DLCC, if we had asked the staff at the time, do we have to do this? It seems like the staff's answer would have been no. And no other national organization did this as well. So when we are applying a standard of fairness to the DLCC, you have to look at what the standard was at the time, not, what it might be in the future or what, a particular advocate thinks it should be. And I think for the reasons that were laid out very clearly in the staff report, it would be imprudent to require this information. It's not consistent with the commission's general approach to having basic thresholds below which expenditures are not required to be reported, and would require a level of administrative cost that just doesn't. The juice ain't worth the squeeze, as the saying goes, right? We are, we'd be requiring an enormous burden on national organizations to track this time minute by minute, hour by hour, at the cost of what? Reporting another couple $100 in in-kind contributions or staff time. It doesn't seem worth it. But again, if that's the rule, we will follow it. But no one here, and Mr. Clardy included, has said that that was the rule, or that any other organization did this, or that this issue's ever been raised to the commission before. So to the extent that the commission wants to make a policy change to require this information, that should be prospective, not looking backwards and imposing it on an organization that was just trying to follow the rules at the time. And I think, as laid out again, especially in the subsequent complaint, from a policy standpoint, from an administrative workability standpoint, this commission is dealing with a lot of big issues. The influx of huge amounts of money, undisclosed money in politics is something that you guys have to deal with on an enormous level. If we are in the place where we are having to argue about whether a particular staffer's time was valued correctly, and we're having complaints there, you'll be consumed with complaints about dollar amounts that just don't come close to what you are dealing with on other more important issues. So from a policy standpoint, we don't think it would be a good idea, but just from a pure sense of rule of law and fairness, this wasn't the rule at the time, and we don't think it would be fair to impose that on our organization alone retrospectively.
All right, thank you. Any commission members have questions for Mr. Burkhardt? No, okay. Mr. Wayne, would you like to kind of follow up with anything?
Yeah, well, I hate to inform Mr. Clardy of this, but I agree with a lot of the points Mr. Burkhardt made. I think you need to look at what are the informational interests of these laws. They're intended to provide information to the public about who's spending money on communications, where do they get their money from, and some transactional information about how is the group paying vendors. From our point of view, we would not, across the board, we do not expect national groups or even local groups, if they are spending staff time selecting candidates and overseeing a vendor on independent expenditure communications, we expect the payments to the vendor to be reported, but we don't expect them to be doing this kind of interior accounting. And a lot of groups don't imagine they need to do that. And it's not just the national groups. I mean, there's also, small organizations here in Maine, business groups. I don't want to name names because I'll probably be incorrect, but we've got grocers, we've got retailers, we've got doctors, we've got educators. There's a lot of groups that have limited staff and they want to get their message out about candidates, and they choose to do it through independent communications. And even these small groups in Maine, they don't imagine that they have to track their staff time per candidate. And I guess when you think about the benefit to the public, versus the sort of the administrative burden and the expense on these local groups and the national groups to have to keep all this track time and the relatively small amounts that would be reported. As a matter of policy, we don't think it is worth the effort. That can be decided later on if you'd like, in the appropriate way. And I think, but we haven't expected it until now. And so we think there is a fairness issue that we don't expect to see it. This is a standard we haven't held other groups to, and I think it would be unfair to fault this group for not including that in the reports. I also think that candidates, we do expect candidates to have high standards. But candidates, they know what money's coming in, they know what's coming out, they don't employ people. So we do expect a fair amount of exactitude from candidates, rightly so. But we're talking, when you start, they don't employ people. So it's another layer of burden to ask people to do this kind of accounting. Campaign finance reports.
Commissioner.
Yes, I have a question. I know each of the caucuses in the legislature has a campaign arm each cycle. And each of those campaign arms has staff. Do you now expect them to report the staff, a breakdown of how the salary of each staff member is expended per candidate? Is that something that I'm asking Mr. Wayne.
Yes, I don't believe we do. I'm going to refer that to Emma. We want them, if they are employing staff, the caucuses, they do so much. It's not just IEs, they pay staff for
Right.
Get out the vote.
Yeah.
Advising
And
candidates.
I know that
Yes,
they
so
helped
we
me. I
ex-
know when I was running, I had assistants from staff members all the time.
Yeah.
I didn't have a dedicated one, but I had assistants on a regular basis. Obviously, when we bought an ad, that got reported, but were they being asked to report the staff time to you?
Not per candidate, I don't believe.
No, I mean, so certainly if the caucuses, the caucus packs, groups will hire like field directors, regional directors. Those you see as expenditures because those are like a salary payment to those individuals. But as far as the people who split their time between the legislature and kind of being the head of the caucus pack, no, they don't report in kind their time or split out their time as to what's spent on this and what's spent on campaign.
Well, like a regional director would, his or her time wouldn't be apportioned amongst the candidates.
No, that's just,
It would
it's
just be reported as that
a
person.
salary, typically every 2 weeks.
I know.
every month.
When I was running as a clean election candidate, none of that money got used against my upper limit of spending. None of that time was ever
No.
applied to that.
And we do have exceptions in statute for how much state party employees can have per candidate, how many hours per candidate they can without that time being considered an in-kind contribution.
And that reflects a legislative decision in the context of candidates receiving
Yeah.
services from state parties that they didn't want to have candidates go through that for.
Briefly, Mr. Clark.
Yeah, I was actually was trying to highlight that, yeah, the state allows state parties, or the legislature has granted state parties gratis up to 40 hours per candidate that doesn't have to be reported. But they didn't extend that to committees. So staff time provided to committees was not included in that provision. I would assume that was a deliberate exclusion. And that also only applies to state parties, not national parties, not national organizations. And I apologize because this is something that, because I was working off a prior draft, I omitted from my final conclusion. You have very broad powers to mitigate and show mercy for good faith errors. I realize that this is a significant change in what policy is that staff has been advising committees to do for reporting practices. But I think it's a legitimate public interest policy change, because if the NRA or the DLCC is invading Maine politics, I want to know whether they're sending in a company of paid professionals or 2 Cub Scouts in a canoe. because that really does matter. And at the end of the day, I'm not into trying to cripple the DLCC or ALCC, Maine. I just want them to be as transparent and compliant as Maine law requires and as is in the interests of voters here in Maine. So if you do agree that, you know, we should have some visibility into how big their investment in Maine is, then I would expect you to also need to come back and decide how best to implement that. And honestly, I would consider that a great opportunity for them to show, you know, their willingness to cooperate by allowing you to discuss with however many of their staff are still employed that were part of the 2022 campaign cycle, how much time, you know, retrospectively they can estimate was spent on that, so that we can make a reasonable, so that you can make a reasonable informed policy decision as to whether this really is something significant, or if it is just, you know, conversations over water cooler.
Thank you. Mr. Burkhardt, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to a couple points that Mr. Clardy made. The DLCC did not invade Maine. I just want to provide some context here. There were communications that were sent to voters in Maine that did cost a significant amount of money, and the value of those communications were reported, right? The actual communications that went to Maine voters, the full value of those communications were reported. The amount that was spent on production, the amount that was, was spent on the vendors, on the creative. That information was reported. That's what Maine voters deserve to know. And that information was reported. So yes, the amount that ALC Maine or DLCC, through its funding of ALC Maine, spent to actually influence elections is known. So the value of that is known. And it was more, obviously it was more than a Cub Scout in a canoe, but that information was reported. The idea that the commission would utilize its resources to go to a bunch of 20-something-year-olds or 30-something-year-old staffers and ask them what they were doing with particularity 7 or 8 months ago. Can you imagine trying to be interviewed, anyone here, and answer a question as to what you did 7 or 8 months ago? Would that information be accurate? I mean, I can, again, without my timesheets, which I have to prepare, if you ask me on stuff that's not in the timesheet, I can't remember what I did 2 weeks ago. So now you're going to invest a huge ton of staff resources. I imagine the staff's already stretched thin doing the important work that this commission does. And to go back and interview a bunch of 20 and 30-year-old staffers and figure out exactly what they were doing 7, 8 months ago, to figure out whether they spent 2 hours, 3 hours, 1 hour, a half hour, 20 minutes on this stuff. What is the policy interest in doing that when the law didn't require it at the time? I am want to echo the comments of Mr. Wayne. I think it would be an enormous mistake for the commission to move forward in that direction. But regardless of what the commission does from a policy standpoint, that wasn't what was required at the time.
Thank you very much. I think it makes sense to to organize this, to divide it into the 3 issues that I think generally people agree exist here, and discuss and vote on each of them by themselves. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, great. So I think the first issue to deal with is the legal fees that were unreported until quite a late date. And so I'll make a motion that ALC Maine be found liable for reporting it's $55,654 of legal fees late on their 42-day post-general report.
Second.
Is there discussion of that? Okay, seeing none, we'll move to a vote. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, please say no. Okay, now we come to the question of the penalty for that. And Mr. Burkhardt, I assume you would request a waiver?
We do request a waiver, Commissioner. Thank you.
You bet. Because the preliminary penalty is the full amount of the $55,654. I would propose, and I'll make a motion, that we assess a fine of $2,500 for the violation that we just found. And in support of that, I'll say that I looked at the history of the fines imposed for similar violations, and the $2,500 seems to fit well into that.
Second.
Is there discussion?
I know that the staff recommendation was a reduction to 2,000. So I guess it just looking closely, you felt like 2,500 is more closely aligned with.
I did, based upon the previous violations. I mean, we could have, there were some that would have argued for even more, but the last several, which were connected with the corridor question, were $2,500.
And looking at this, the American Leadership Committee is a fairly sophisticated organization. And is that being taken into account? I'm looking through this. Thank you for this list of previous penalties. I'm seeing Senate Democratic campaign. Top of the page had a preliminary penalty of 1,000. Final penalty was 750. Is there a way within this to assess or consider the level of sophistication that you're dealing with this particular complaint?
I think the statute allows us to do that. Do you have a proposal?
Well, I'm somewhat sympathetic to Mr. Clardy's comments about, local candidates having significant penalties, relatively speaking. And so I am concerned that the penalties suggested here today might not be appropriate.
I buy that argument. Commissioner Hastings.
You know, I think I would agree with you had that money been spent on advocacy. If that had been $56,000 spent on ads, it wasn't reported. But this money was kind of an administrative expense that really had nothing to do with advocating for any particular campaign. So in light of that, I mean, we did impose significant penalties to a group, Maine Municipal Power, because they had failed to report a very large amount of money spent on last minute ads. This is a little different. I mean, it's somewhat like they didn't report the electric bill. I mean, it's a bigger scale, but it had nothing to do with getting anybody. I don't think the public was harmed by not knowing that they didn't pay the legal bill, or that they didn't know they had a legal bill. So I'm sympathetic. I'm comfortable with the current motion.
Is there any further discussion? What do you think?
I appreciate Commissioner Hastings' comment.
If there's no further discussion, we'll take a vote. And the motion is to impose a waived fine of 25, or to impose a fine of $25,000 or $2,500.
2,500.
Yes, exactly. Which is a reduction from the preliminary penalty that was originally figured out. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no. Okay, thank you. The next issue to deal with, I think, is the reporting date of the video. And I will move that we take no further action on that complaint.
Second that.
Okay. And my reason for that is that I appreciate your argument about the common sense of the situation. The common sense leads you to think that activities went on beforehand, but the statute specifically says that let me find it. that expenditures are not expenditures until they're expenditures to support or defeat a specific candidate. And I don't think that you've given us any evidence to provide a date on which that decision was.
I would quibble
Well,
that.
I'm not gonna. Is there discussion amongst the commissioners?
No, I agree.
agree. Okay, let's have a vote. All in favor of the motion to take no further action, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no. The third issue is the reporting staff time. And I will again make a motion that we take no more action on this. Is there a second?
Second.
And I do think this is an interesting issue. And I think that there's a line somewhere between what we have here and, hiring a bunch of employees to specifically work on Maine campaigns. And I don't know exactly where that line is. Since we're a body that considers the question before us, we don't have to decide where that line is. But I think the line is somewhere above the normal staff activity to support the mission of the overall organization.
May I share a comment with Mr. Clark, please? Just about my thinking on this. And I want to repeat, Commissioner Hastings, thank you for your complaint and its thoroughness in its organization. I want to thank you for bringing this here, because it's one thing to study all the materials at home, and it's another to actually hear the parties speaking here today. And you've raised some good issues. You've raised some things that are not resolved. And I think you've raised some concerns that you'd like to see resolved that may not get resolved at the same time. But when you were talking about this issue of a national organization connected to another national organization, connected to a state organization, connected to local parties, I started sitting here thinking, all right, because this is how my mind works. There are a couple people senior in the National Democratic Organization, maybe even in the White House, that have an offline conversation, and that morphs into something else. And that turns into a conversation on the golf course about what are 2 or 3 key issues we should look at next year in local races. And they start having that conversation, and abortion becomes one for whatever reason, and a couple other things like that. But by the time you go through all the real world connectivity to where political strategy and concepts start, and who's working on those issues, and how their job titles are or are not delineated to that kind of level of specificity, I think for me, your concern remains valid, but the argument falls apart. I don't think it's truly measurable beyond what we have to work with now, which is what we're deciding. And I just, without beating that to death, wanted to give you a sense of what I'm thinking before we vote.
Any other thoughts from commissioners? Okay, we'll move on to a vote, and the motion is that we spend no further resources on this question. It's been moved and seconded. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, please say no. Okay, thank you. All right, so we'll move on to agenda item 3. It is a thick one. This is a complaint against the DLCC, and I think the same parties are all interested in here and will be interested in speaking. And so, Mr. Wayne, if you could give us kind of some background.
Sure. Well, the Democratic Leadership Campaign Committee made some very large contributions to 4 PACs here in Maine. And to the best of our knowledge, the 4 PACs that received the money all reported those contributions correctly. And the DLCC believed and still believes that it does not have to register as a PAC because it is basically an exempt donor, which is a defined term in Maine finance law. And to be an exempt donor, there's certain criteria, and Mr. Clardy is arguing that the DLCC doesn't meet those criteria. And his focus is on 2 websites. One of them is dlcc.org. And then another one is Republican Insurrectionists .co. There's no M in the URL. So Mr. Clardy is saying that through these websites, the DLCC received contributions for the purpose of influencing Maine elections, therefore it's not an exempt donor. And also, DLCC made expenditures to its staff for purposes of creating these web pages that promote Democratic candidates. And so it's made expenditures other than the contributions it made to the main PACs. And for that reason, also, it's not an exempt donor. And as we state in the memo, the DLCC has explained on the fundraising side where those donate buttons go to. Some of the on the dlcc.org website, the donate, if someone clicks on the donate button, it goes to not to the DLCC's treasury, but it goes to the candidate campaigns and the local caucus PACs. That's Mr. Burkhan can speak to that, but that's how I'm understanding that. With respect to RepublicanInsurrectionists.com website, that money did go to the DLCC, but there's not I don't think, based on our review, it seems like anyone clicking on that button would be pretty clear to them that it's going to the DLCC mission generally. It's not necessarily going to the Maine to influence Maine elections. So we think that's been rebutted. And then we agree with the argument that it would be administratively burdensome to ask the DLCC to track time. We think it takes minimal time to enter some content on these candidate spotlight pages per candidate, and that isn't anything we would have ever advised. So there's also a fairness issue. So our overall recommendation is not to take any action on any of the assertions.
Thank you. Mr. Clardy, would you like to tell us about your complaint?
Sure. Mr. Ring, are they claiming that they're an exempt donor, or are they claiming the out-of-state exemption for the PAC?
We'll have to let them speak to that.
Right, because that actually is rather significant to my complaint. And first off, thank you again for an opportunity to explain my other complaint. And this started with Mr. Burkhan's response to my first complaint, the part about not reporting staff costs and in-kind contributions. In a nutshell, we don't know, we don't care, and that's all settled at this point in time. My natural response was, well, you may not care, but some of us do. And I wondered about making a reasonable guesstimate on their behalf if they didn't have the records. So I did what any intrepid investigator would do. I asked Google. I typed in Maine site or Maine space site : dlcc.org. And I figured it might help me find a list of what states they targeted for their campaign efforts this year, so we could figure out what portion of their efforts was dedicated to Maine. And shortly after that, my dog decided to leave the room because he didn't like the sound of my voice. I'm going to tell you right now that I think your staff and potentially Mr. Burkhan is overthinking this. And I'd be surprised if Mr. Burkhan isn't inclined to lead everybody out into the weeds overthinking it. Because I see there are three basic questions here. If the DLCC's address were over on State Street, would they have been required to register as a PAC in Maine? Because their address isn't over on State Street, do they qualify for the out-of-staters exemption for registration as a PAC? And third, depending upon the answers to the first two, what are y'all inclined to do about any of that? So starting with, do the DLCC's actions qualify them as a political action? The statutory definition is any person, including any corporation or association other than an individual, that receives contributions or makes expenditures aggregating more than $2,500 in a calendar year for the purpose of influencing the nomination or election of any candidate to political office, meaning any candidate in Maine. Is the DLCC a corporation? Check. They were incorporated in the good old District of Columbia. Did the DLCC make expenditures aggregating more than $2,500 with an intent to influence the outcome of Maine elections? I see $911,000 in reported contributions from the DLCC to Maine's House and Senate Democratic campaign committees and to Maine Strong, which they spent money. it goes up to about 1.4 million if you tack in the money they routed through ALC Maine. So I would say by that standard, they qualify as a PAC. Did the DLCC qualify for the out-of-state exemption? Which is what I would think as a PAC, they would be the only option they have. I think I thought exempt donors was individuals, but I may be wrong on that. But under section 1053B, a out-of-state PAC which is registered with the FEC or some other out-of-state jurisdiction is not required to register if its only financial activity within the state is to make contributions to candidates, party committees, yada, yada, yada. And the committee has not raised and accepted any contributions during the calendar year to influence a campaign within the state. Clearly, Maine's share of DLCC's activity concerning Maine elections was shoveling money to other PACs. Don't think anybody's going to dispute that. But they also advocated expressly to influence the election or defeat of several Maine legislative candidates, both in 2022 and in special elections during 2021. Let's see. I think I've got a slightly better, or slightly better view, but their blog entry about reproductive freedom fighters. They explicitly list off several candidates, including 2 candidates from Maine, including a little bio about them. And in the Commission's PAC handbook, one of the standards for advocating expressly is if you provide a list of candidates, for example, saying, these people are pro-choice or pro-life, here's the list, and vote for pro-choice or pro-life people. 20 pro-choice candidates in must-win races who need your support right now, I would say qualifies as the list of candidates with a particular characteristic that are therefore good and deserve your vote. On the flip side, there's also, the worst of the worst page. Pardon me, I'm slightly jumbled here, but this is the RepublicanInsurrectionists.co website, where they created a Maine specific page titled Maine Threats. And they have a worst of the worst list, starting with Eric Brakey running for SD 20, followed by Jeffrey Hanley running for SD 14, and so on down the list of, a few dozen specifically identified Maine candidates who are evil Republican insurrectionists for whatever. A lot of them voted no on a resolution. Some of them did more than that. I'm not saying that that's right or wrong, targeting them. I'm just saying it does qualify as advocating expressly. They also included candidates' highlight pages for, I think, about 3 or 4 candidates in special elections in 2021, and several in the 2020 election, the 2022 election. If you want a easier to read one, this is what those pages look like. They include the candidate's picture, what district they're running on, a brief bio of the candidate, issues that they think the candidate is really, really good on. And I believe they have had 16 candidates in the 2022 election highlighted this way on dlcc.org. Not as a press release, because I don't think I've ever seen a press release with a button for please donate. But as a, yes, we endorse this person. We think you should vote for them. Advocacy. So, yeah, Now, did they fundraise for actually fundraise for these candidates? I'd say the buttons say yes. A slightly better view of the page that those buttons would take you to on Act Blue looks like this, where it says fundraiser info or fundraiser information, fundraiser, Democratic legislative campaign. Now, the law says it's raise and collect. According to Mr. Burkhan, they never collected the money by carefully crafting their Act Blue campaigns. The money stayed out of their hands, and so, I think they may have successfully split that hair. So there's that. Now, another aspect of that is, did publishing those candidate highlights constitute an expenditure? Mr. Burkhan says no, because it was salaried staff, no additional cost. And to that, I would say, dedicating the time of one or more employees to designing, creating, approving, and publishing those pages on the DLCC's website constitutes an expenditure. I think if you asked me to, I would have no trouble finding court decisions where courts have found, yes, if you have a salaried employee and you tell them do this, then that is an expenditure of their time, which means an expenditure of your money, because their time is no longer available for doing something else. And yeah, I kind of think it probably did take a little bit of time to do that. And this is, despite what Mr. Burkhan may say about, they're tracking thousands of candidates in 50 states. How many states do you see highlighted here? Maine is right there. 1 of 7. So Maine got its own page. Maine got its own list. I think that does qualify as, yes, they were advocating expressly, and yes, that particular advocacy was an expenditure. Why they were doing that through their own website when they had already organized and crafted ALC Maine as a cutout to handle all their Maine stuff, I do not know. I mean, if I was being really blunt and honest, I'd say it was, somebody had a real severe moment of stupidity. But be that as it may, it's their right to make choices that basically undermine their protected firewall. So, I would say, since if they did expend corporate resources on Maine, they would have exempted themselves from that exception. But the other part of that is that if they are a PAC, then those decisions actually don't really matter much, or may not matter much, because that exception is only for out-of-state committees which are registered as a PAC with the FEC or some other out-of-state jurisdiction. Now, I didn't say anything in my complaint because I was just taking a quick look and I didn't want to speak too soon and prove myself wrong. But since then, I have, dedicated a modest amount of time to checking the FEC records, and I find no record of either the ALC or the DLCC registering with the FEC. And I'd be inclined to bet they probably haven't registered as a PAC with any other state, since they don't want to register as a PAC with Maine. So if that's the case, then I don't see them as being even eligible for an out-of-state exemption, despite there being a PAC, or they're qualifying as a PAC for Maine purposes. And that comes around to really the third question, which is, what are y'all gonna do about all this. And, this is where Mr. Burkon gets his say. Hopefully, he won't successfully lead you too far out into the weeds. But I see it as really very simple on this question. Unlike a lot of the question or the date questions and whatnot that we were dealing with the ALC.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Burkon.
Thank you very much. So I think just to address the core legal question or the provision we're operating under here, just so we can frame the rest of the discussion. As we argued in our response, and as I think the staff concludes in its analysis, the exemption that we were operating under is the exempt donor exemption, as opposed to the out-of-state committee exemption. I think we would qualify for the out-of-state committee exemption, but we're not actually arguing that here today. We're talking about the exempt donor exemption. So I think to the extent that Mr. Clardy's analysis relies on his view of the out-of-state committee exemption, its relevance to our response and his complaint and the staff's analysis is, I think, misplaced. So the exempt donor requirement provides that a person that has not received contributions for the purpose of influencing a campaign in the prior 2 years and whose only payments of money to influence a campaign in the prior 2 years are either contributions of money to basically registered committees or payments for goods and services with an aggregate value of no more than $100,000 contributed to party committees. Okay, so that's the exempt donor provision, which, and Mr. Wayne can correct me if I am wrong, was either introduced or at least modified when the legislature rewrote or amended the campaign finance laws, I want to say in 2021. So the legislature looked at this question and at least reaffirmed the out-of-state committee exemption was always sort of there, but I think exempt donor is sort of a new definition. Mr. Wayne, though, please correct me if that's incorrect. But what the exempt donor exemption is getting at, it reflects an underlying policy analysis, I think, by the legislature, which I think is a reasonable one, which is we want to make sure that Maine activity is reported somewhere in Maine, right? We want some registered committee to be reporting the contributions and expenditures in Maine. But we don't need is double reporting, right? We don't need the same information being reported twice. We don't need the same information being reported by the donor and by the recipient. And that's the policy rationale here, right? So if in organizations only activity within a 2-year period is to make contributions to registered committees, those contributions are being reported by the registered committees. As Mr. Wayne said, the money, which was substantial, that the DLCC invested in Maine during the cycle was all reported by registered committees in Maine, including ALC Maine. The other kind of prong there, right, is that the legislature wants to know when donations are being accepted by any organization for the purpose of influencing Maine elections, right? We not only want to know kind of the expenditure side, but to the extent the donor is giving for the purpose of influencing a Maine election, we want to know that. So any money raised through the Act Blue page that went to specific Maine committees, that went to either Maine candidates or the caucus, that money was reported, right? If I gave money through that website, it went to a candidate, one of the non-publicly financed candidates, or it went to the caucus, my donation, assuming it's above the threshold, is going to be reported by the committee in state. That information is disclosed. The donations that were made off the Stop the Insurrectionists website were not made for the purpose of influencing a Maine election. I'm not sure Mr. Clardy has introduced any evidence otherwise. Those donations were made explicitly to help the DLCC's national program, not to influence a Maine election. And Maine law draws a clear distinction between those two types of donations. If you're giving for a purpose other than influencing a Maine election, that is not a contribution in Maine. That is required to be disclosed if it is given to a non-committee versus a donation that is earmarked for Maine elections, which is, right? The language that I think the staff correctly points out on that Maine website says that your grassroots donation, I'm reading this verbatim, your grassroots donation will help provide state Democrats with the resources, staff, and technology to win elections at the state level. It doesn't say Maine. And then next, which if the other one wasn't clear, I think this one is, the Stop the Insurrectionist Fund will support the DLCC's efforts to elect Democrats to state legislatures nationwide. We say explicitly nationwide, not for Maine, not for any other state, but nationwide, right? This is money, this is grassroots money. It's being raised in the DLCC that can be spent consistent with state campaign finance laws in other states. So every dollar that was donated for the purpose of influencing a Maine election was disclosed by the Maine committee that received it. Donations made by the DLCC to Maine entities were disclosed by those recipient entities, and therefore the DLCC qualified as an exempt donor under the provision. And that is consistent. That's not a loophole. That's not, I think Mr. Clardy suggested that we kind of, thread the needle. That's the law, that essentially the activity just needs to be reported once by a Maine committee. It doesn't need to be double reported by the donor. And that's a reasonable policy. And it's a policy the legislature arrived at, not even the commission, but the legislature arrived at. The only other argument that I think Mr. Clardy is advancing is, again, which I think is largely indistinguishable from the debate we had on the prior complaint, is whether these, small staff time hours are somehow expenditures that themselves need to be reported. And I think largely for the same reasons that were laid out in the prior matter, they should not be. And again, I want to go back to the question of fairness, rule of law, due process, right? At a basic level, the regulated community needs to know what regulations it is operating under. That is the underlying premise really of all law, and particularly law that governs like core First Amendment activity, when it's sometimes hard to make these distinctions. And here the staff admits, I'm trying to find the language in the staff report, but the staff essentially says that had the staff been asked the question of whether these expenditures are reportable, they would have likely said no at the time, right? This is the staff who is advising the regulated community whether or not these, an hour here or an hour here spread over candidates across 38 states, whether there's a need to allocate, 10 minutes here, 15 minutes here, the staff itself would have said that that is not reportable, and it's not a reportable expenditure for the same reasons that we laid out before, the same reasons that several of the commissioners laid out before, that it is an administrative burden that is incredibly difficult to impose on national organizations, and that more importantly, regardless of the policy or the burden, it wasn't imposed. It wasn't imposed on any other organization. And here it's on the page 7 and 8, it says, the commission does not have to accept this view, of course, but the fact that the relevant commission employee would have offered this advice based on current law and policies suggests it may be unfair to expect the DLCC to have reached a different conclusion, right? We are following the guidance that the staff would have given to any organization. And if the limited amount of staff time here, that again would fall below any of the thresholds that are laid out, well below the $100,000 threshold for the exempt donor rule, below the other thresholds that are typically applied when reporting, other Maine regulable activities. If none of those expenses are reportable expenditures, then the DLCC clearly falls within the exempt donor requirement, because it had not received earmarked Maine contributions, and all of its other Maine activities were reported by other committees. So that's why we think that the commission should take no further action on this particular matter.
Thank you, Mr. Burkon. Commissioners, any questions? Yes.
An observation and a simple question. Mr. Burkon, are you aware that when you were reading the definition of exemption, you omitted the word candidate or candidates, which is in both sections? You said payments for goods or services, for example, with an aggregate value of no more than $100,000 contributed to, and then you glossed over the word candidates. I'm not sure what to make of it. It was just something you did a couple times. And the question for you, sir, is who are you representing this morning?
In this particular matter, we're representing the DLCC.
Okay. So the first matter was ALC, now it's DLCC.
Correct.
That doesn't help me either. Thank you.
Any other questions from commissioners? I have a question, Mr. Burkhan. You stated that all of the money from the DLCC had been reported once it was passed through to the other organizations. But I don't think you would argue that all those web pages were express advocacy that to defeat or elect a candidate. Where were those expenses reported?
So I think a couple
The
points.
people, the people of the state of Maine.
Yeah, so I think a couple of points there. First of all, I think as the staff concluded, the activity on the Maine Threats website, though it does mention Maine candidates, is not itself express advocacy under the standard that the commission has applied. And the effort to link essentially different press releases that were promulgated, that the press releases may have had express advocacy, to other websites that do not, is not the typical way that the staff and the commission analyze the question of express advocacy. So I think, just first and foremost, as the staff concluded, though the Maine Threats website refers to 39 individuals as candidates, the page does not contain the explicit urging of a vote for or against a candidate that defines express advocacy. So I question the premise kind of there being express advocacy. But ultimately, it gets back to the question of whether or not the minimal costs associated with maintaining a website, again, that is dedicated to candidates in 38 states, that 5-year cost is $250. Or a staff member that is working, doing a million different things and happens to spend a little bit of time maintaining a website, whether or not those are expenditures. So even if there may be some express advocacy on a website, the question is whether or not there is a reportable expenditure, not whether some website has express advocacy. And again, I will just point to the fact that there are websites across the country that comment on Maine elections that urge votes for or against the candidates that aren't regulated because they don't meet the expenditure threshold. The regulation of internet activity that doesn't carry with it any marginal cost, right? These aren't paid ads. Organizations anywhere will have some commentary on national elections, state elections, local elections. That activity isn't reported. I mean, every website in the country that comments on Donald Trump or Joe Biden, they're not reporting independent expenditures to the FEC because they're not actually expending marginal costs on those communications, right? It may be a staff member that's putting something up on a website. That is not it has not been the traditional position of this commission to regulate internet activity that doesn't have a marginal cost associated with it. And again, doing so would not only be inconsistent with the rules in place at the time, but would mark a sea change that would require this commission to peruse internet websites across the country that may be talking about Maine candidates, which are going to be hundreds. Like not only the main national organizations, but all organizations are going to have some commentary. And the line in the sand, the administrable line in the sand is there a marginal cost associated above the statutory threshold? Because if we don't apply that rule, we are going to be looking at the millions of websites across this country that may mention candidates. And that's just not the position that this commission has taken, that in my understanding that any other regulator, certainly not the FEC, has taken as well.
Thank you. Any other questions from commissioners, questions or comments? Okay. I'll make a motion that we have not received enough information to demonstrate that the DLCC must register as a PAC. Is there a second?
I'll say.
Okay. Discussion? Please.
May I ask a question of Mr. Wayne?
You may.
And I apologize to my fellow commissioners if this is as stupid a question as it may be. But again, in rereading this material, Jonathan, you cite they spent a total of 1.3 million, and that's the DLCC did, to the ALC and 3 other PACs in Maine dedicated to promoting Democratic candidates. And on the next page, on page 5, again, we have the language about the exempt donor, which under B cites an aggregate value of no more than $100,000.
Or
Services.
Yeah,
Let me hear the internal answer to that first, please.
So A is intended to be when. there's some-
Okay, so I can
Yeah.
ignore, if A is met, I can ignore B. Is that what we're saying?
No,
They have to meet both A and B, but they refer to different things. So A refers to when a source or an organization or person is giving money to these
Okay.
folks. The other one is when they're not giving money, but they're paying for some kind of good or service
Okay,
that is contributed.
all right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
any other questions or comments from commissioners? I think, does everybody agree that that motion will cover the issue that's raised by the complaint?
Yes.
Okay, so we'll move on to vote. All in favor of the motion that there's not been enough evidence presented that the DLCC must register as a PAC, please say aye. All opposed, please say no. And Mr. Clardy, thank you for bringing these to us. It serves an important function for us to be able to consider these kinds of questions.
If I could make one, not going to change anything at this point, comment. The exempt donor says a person. The PAC definition says a person, including corporations.
The law treats a PAC as a person.
But when the law specifies corporations as a specific, as included within the person for one page, but does not make that specific inclusion in another.
It doesn't necessarily eliminate that.
I realize it doesn't, and I just was,
No, but that's an interesting, I mean,
but that is why I did not think that the exempt donor
of course.
definition applied.
No, I understand. Thank you. And again, I appreciate you having brought these questions to us. Thank you.
That back and forth, somehow that
Oh,
got
sure.
in my house.
Everybody, like a 3-5 minute break?
I'll be quick. I just have to-
Yeah, let's take a brief 5-minute break.
Sorry, somehow I have.
No.
We're taking a break
I
anyway.
said, okay.
I think that you performed a
Your
function.
action
Yeah.
has more con-
Yeah.
I don't know it, but I bet.
Precedence.
I will check.
Shot.
All right, we have agenda item 4, which is the resolution of the staff review of the 2022 Mark Lawrence campaign. Mr. Wayne.
Yeah, this is a report back by the staff on a review that we were doing of Senator Mark Lawrence's reelection campaign. And in January, we had been in touch with him about some issues of his 24-hour reporting. And he had been relying during the campaign on a campaign manager and a treasurer. And I should also add, he ran a pretty large campaign that spent, well, we paid him $62,000 and he returned 5,600 of that. So there was a lot of transactions. And he self-reported some errors to us saying, I've looked at all the bank statements, I've compared it to what was reported. And he did find a handful of transactions that had not been recorded correctly. The campaign had received on the issues that I would call minor reporting issues. He was allowed to collect limited seed money contributions at the beginning of the campaign before receiving the public funds, and he had omitted, or the staff had omitted 2 seed money contributions totaling $150. Then there were 4 expenditures that were not reported. One was a payment to staff, which he has since returned to us. And then there was the thing that concerned us the most was that he said there were 3 electronic debits from his campaign that they didn't authorize, and they had no idea how or why these took place. And that was of concern to us. And you authorized us to do an investigation, and we subpoenaed some of the payees, and there was a natural gas utility and a trash hauling payment platform. And we could tell from the records that we got back, the account and the individual who benefited from them. Then we contacted the bank and talked to an operations manager there, and she seemed very certain about how these happened, which is another depositor who had an account number that was very close to Senator Lawrence's, except for the last digit, she believes was making payments to the trash hauling service and the natural gas service, and somehow made a typo or had misremembered the correct account number, and that Senator Lawrence's account was debited. And I said, really? That
It's that simple?
Isn't there a safeguard?
Yeah, well, it's crazy. She's like,
She said, no, nothing we can do about it. This happens regularly.
That's what got.
It's
That's
bizarre.
the amazing
It is
part.
Yeah.
bizarre.
There's so many three-factor authentication, all this
Yeah,
stuff.
you're
Yeah,
right.
you just like do it.
I know, I mean, I guess I
Just
thought,
put down a different
Yeah.
account.
Yeah,
They don't even have to answer who's your favorite teacher.
Yeah, right.
Can't remember street.
Is that a capital or not a capital?
yeah, I mean, she was so convinced that's what happened, and it did coincide with the information we got from the utilities that that's very plausible. We don't see any reason to fault anyone in the campaign for the debits were made. We wish they had been caught. You know, two of them were not caught by the campaign. We wish they had been caught, but the money has been returned to us by the bank to our fund. So all in all, our point of view is that these issues have been resolved satisfactorily, and we don't think there's any need to take any further action.
It's a relief, honestly, that it was
Yep.
that easily explainable.
All's well that ends well.
Yeah. All right, so I'll move that we take no further action on this investigation.
Second.
Any discussion? Okay, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no. All right, thank you. Agenda item 5 is the Maine Clean Election Act. Ms. Gordon,
Howdy.
how are you?
Wonderful, how are you?
Great.
We have our deck restained as of this past weekend, so I'm just ready to be outside.
Awesome,
Nice.
awesome. Well, tomorrow is going to be the day.
Well, tomorrow I'll be here.
I was gonna say. Not sure you're helping.
Some months back, I sat in front of you and went over some numbers from 2022's MCEA cycle, and Commissioner Marvel had an additional question for me. I took that question and we incorporated it into the MCEA study report that we're required to release every so often, 4 or 5 years. So I thought I could answer that question for you, Commissioner, and then if you folks have had a chance to look at this and you wanted to ask any questions about it, or I don't know, it's and then I'm here to answer those questions. So your question, Commissioner, had been, do we see a trend one way or the other in candidates who have used the MCEA program before, how they qualify for supplemental payments? So I looked at all of the MCEA qualified candidates in 2018, 2020, and 2022. That was a pool of 122 and 3-time program participants across those 3 cycles. Only of all of those 120 participants that had used the program before, 24% of those folks qualified for less MCEA funding in subsequent elections than they have previously. 33% stated about the same level of MCEA funding, and 43% of those, yeah, they qualified for more. And you know, we can't know for certain why a particular candidate qualifies for the funding level they qualify for. But anecdotally, many candidates say that, you know, once they know that they can get 5 supplemental payments, they'll go out and do that again because the pattern is familiar, the door knocking, the process of it, all of that they already know how to do, they know it's achievable, and so they'll go out and get that at least the same amount, if not more, next time around. So that is my answer for you, Commissioner.
Thank you.
I have just something that just occurred to me. Can they go to the same people that they've gotten contributions from before?
Yes, in subsequent cycles, yes, in the same cycle, no.
Okay. And your observation was pretty remarkable here, that you said that if the trend continues of people, more successfully getting supplemental payments, that the financial instability means.
Yes, that's something that at some point will likely need to be addressed. When you think about how long the program has been in place and what $5 could buy you in 2010,
Right.
and what $5 can buy you now. Is it worth, should we look at the cost of a qualifying contribution? At one point you could buy a whole lunch for $5. You cannot do that today.
Or 2 dozen eggs.
Well, now you can.
You're right.
So,
Yeah, I brought this up before, maybe at the last meeting, I don't remember. And I would personally say, please make this a priority of making us a recommendation, because personally, I think it needs to go up. I'm thinking of people running a memory through my head of, doors I knocked on, conversations I had and everything. And I really believe that if someone were willing to make a $5 donation in 2015 or whatever it was, they would do 10 today, for the most part. The vast majority would. I think there may be a need.
And it's probably not a huge crisis until the next governor's race. Right?
Yes, that is where you tend to see, if the fund is going to, that's a stress test.
Yeah,
As a
yeah.
gubernatorial MCA
That could
campaign.
be explosive.
And it requires legislative action to
Yeah.
change just about anything.
Yeah.
Commissioner Hayes?
This is very interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
But I'm looking at a table on page 5. Average total receipts. That was been my understanding. The purpose of the Maine Clean Election Act was to level the playing field.
Yeah.
So that a person without means would be able to compete with those who are out there and have the ability to raise a lot of money.
Right.
And I look at this. The House and the Senate NCA average receipts is far greater than the average amount that those running traditionally have been able to or are raising.
In every case?
And to me, that maybe we're a little bit over generous with this. And that's more than leveling the playing field. The typical Maine clean election candidate received more than twice as much as the average traditionally funded candidate. And I'm all, it's one thing to be for leveling the playing field, but it's another thing to say that we really want to give those an advantage over those that have chosen to be traditionally funded, which doesn't require the expenditure of public funds. And that's just a comment. I mean, these are far more generous amounts, MCA amounts than for instance, when I was running 12 years ago, I think in the Senate campaign, I'm not sure, it was like $17,000 or $18,000, and the upper limit was quite a bit less.
It's tricky on these numbers
And
though.
that was, and at that time, the increase was only triggered by your opponent raising more money. This, you could go out and get this money whether or not your opponent raises anything.
Right, but it's tricky just to look at averages. I mean, as somebody who traditionally funds and has a low account, it's not getting into the minutia. I'm not saying it should, that I found this really helpful and interesting, so thank you so much. But you don't know successful traditionally funded candidates, successfully, publicly funded candidates, that's where, right, trying to level the playing field. It might not be that the candidates who are raising the lower money that brings these down are able to be successful. And so that's sort of apples and oranges. I mean, I see your point, but I don't think these numbers can show
But
us.
I am concerned that it's not even triggered by your opponent raising a lot of money. The extra money, just go out and get some more $5 checks and you can, what's the maximum a Senate candidate could receive? roughly.
Yeah, it's up there. You'll have to forgive me. I don't know the number off the top of my head at the moment. Because it changes every 2 years.
Well, we saw the Senator Lawrence, it was like 63,000,
Yeah.
I think.
It's close to 70.
So that's,
Yeah, this is a powerful table.
I- Let me jump in on this, and I'm glad you
Yeah.
brought it up. Well, this is my morning for stupid questions, so, I was thinking if we had in an ideal world access to a nice little statistical grad program somewhere, so we weren't dumping the work on you guys. I would love to look at more tangible info around specific races that informs these numbers. I think this is what you were saying.
Doesn't the Muskie School do stuff like
I
that?
would think they do. I mean, but I'd like to look at two things. One, a little bit more in depth behind these averages. In other words, where did this information come from? Is it somehow affected by parts of the state or close races or new candidate versus two-term candidate? I don't know if those factor in or not. And I'm not, I don't know a good way to say this without sounding like I'm suggesting something that I'm not. But are there forms of support in a traditionally funded campaign that are not readily reported, like the specific dollars and cents are in clean election? I don't know.
I mean, I ran 2 traditional campaigns and it doesn't seem to me, it seems
Same
to me that
reporting
I
requirements.
reported everything, you
I
know.
think it's the same report.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think there's anything unique to a traditional campaign.
My one failed clean election experience has scalded me for my perspective. Okay.
No, this is a powerful report. I really appreciate you.
I just have one, I haven't found it in here. It's probably in here, I missed it, but how much did we collect from the $5 donation?
Yeah.
Well, if we look at the number of, let's see, let me just do some quick math here.
That's my question around raising the amount.
Pardon?
Right, especially as we're talking about potentially raising.
Yeah, I'm
the
just
amount.
curious what,
Yeah.
I mean, I know it's not a big money getter, but.
So, provided that I have done my multiplication correctly, with 49,500 qualified contributions in the bank for 2022, that's a total of $247,000, $47,500.
Thank you.
And once in a while, we get QCs of more than $5.
Yes, occasionally enthusiastic, but it checks more than $5. That's happening less and less frequently than it used to. But yes, occasionally to get folks who want to write a $50 check to the fund.
And that 2004,
200, yeah.
240, I can't, 247,000. That's the $5 QCs. That's separate from the, I don't know the proper name, but people who put.
Oh, seed money.
Yes,
That's separate.
Yeah.
Is that in here, the seed money amount?
No.
Any idea what that is? And I'm just generally curious.
Nope.
Yeah.
Yeah, the taxpayer checkout.
Yeah,
Yeah, it
Oh,
amounts to
okay.
about $110,000.
I think I had that in some.
How much?
110, 120, something like that.
So, about the seed money the candidates get, that doesn't ever wind up here.
No.
No.
They get to do that.
Yeah. Make it reported, but.
Unless they have some left over.
Any other questions or comments?
Just thanks very
Yeah,
much.
thank you so much.
Thank
This is really, this is a great.
Very welcome.
All right. I think we've reached that point in the meeting. Would anybody like to make a motion?
When we adjourn.
Is there a second? It's not debatable, so so it doesn't need a vote. Well, it does need a vote. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, please say no. No. Or- I did say aye. I'm just confused as hell. So thank you very much. And before anybody goes anywhere, we have a piece of unofficial business to take. we'd like to recognize Jonathan for his 20 years of